Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Some of you may recall that when Kevin Williamson substituted for me on this podcast, he went and got Kent Lastman from the president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a fine niche think tank that I do not want to disparage in any way. I'm a big fan of their work. But as we all know, I am I'm something of an AEI jingoist. So I would like to say that this was a planned response, but in fact, this had been in the calendar for a very long time. Um, we have he doesn't like me. He doesn't like me to call him my boss. He prefers more ornate titles, czar or whatever. But we have the president of the American Enterprise Institute, Robert Doar, joining us. I think this is your second appearance on the Remnant. Welcome back.
It is. It's an honor to be with you, Jonah. We're big listeners in the Doar family, and thanks for having me.
We'll get you the best doctors. We'll get you over that.
Yeah.
So where to begin? I was, known for my copious research for these kinds of for these podcasts. About 5 minutes ago, I was looking on Wikipedia at your Wikipedia page, and the most obvious question that most listeners are going to have is your middle name named after Philip Larkin, the poet?
No. My great grandmother's name was Maggie Larkin.
Uh-huh.
She came to the United States when she was 16, right in the middle of the Civil War, and made her way to Northwest Wisconsin to join her cousins, who were Murphys and McNallys. And she was the hired hand on their farm. And then she married a laborer named John Doar. But Maggie Larkin was the great matriarch of our family, and my father put her name in my middle name.
Does this explain the distinct anti-British slant that you've brought to the American Enterprise Institute?
No, but we do like the Green Isle. There's no doubt about that in the Doar family. But no, I was, my family is of Irish background. My mother was more British background, so maybe that tempered our Irish nationalism.
Yeah. So one of the things we often do when we're talking away from a microphone is we talk about New York, because we are both
you and I.
You and I, yes, we are somewhat. Even though I have not lived in New York in a very long time, I still consider myself a New Yorker. Partly because calling yourself a Washingtonian just feels like such thin gruel.
Oh,
but
awful.
And so again, and I am now exhausting my research on your Wikipedia page. Yeah. I discovered that you were in fact born in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
So like if New York gave out passports, it would be a little inconvenient because you wouldn't be a natural born
I'd
New
have
Yorker.
that problem as well.
Yeah.
So my father made his way to Washington right before I was born, in 1960, to work in the Justice Department for President Eisenhower. And I was born right after that. And so they were Wisconsinites who came to Washington. And we were here until the end of 1967. And then we moved to Brooklyn. And so I was only 7 when we moved to Brooklyn. And so I call myself a Brooklynite or a New Yorker much more than a Washingtonian.
So your dad was a very famous, respected man, very involved in the civil rights movement, from the DOJ side of things, John Doar. But I didn't realize he came to Washington in the Eisenhower administration. Was he a registered Republican?
Oh, yes. He was from a prominent Republican family. His cousin, Warren Knowles, was the governor of Wisconsin, or was subsequently the governor of Wisconsin. His father was a Northwest Republican leader, a lawyer out there. And the only thing is, though, that they're Catholic. And so my grandmother, May Doar, Mary Frances Deneen Doar, quite prominently decided to support JFK in the race in 1960. Although my father was working for the Eisenhower administration and probably was for Nixon. I'm sure it was for Nixon. But the thing that's most interesting about him is that he was really bored in this little town in Northwest Wisconsin. He and my mother had 2 children, and he was, a partner in his family law firm that his father had built. and his brother was his partner. And I think he was feeling out of it, not in the great issues of the day.
Mhm.
He had gone to college in the East and law school in the West, and he felt sort of lost in provincial Northwest Wisconsin. And when he got a chance to come and work in the Civil Rights Division under subsequent Judge Tyler, Ace Tyler, who was the head of the Civil Rights Division in the Eisenhower Administration, even though there was only 6 months to go, and it was a political appointee, he took it because he really just wanted to save his life by getting into the flow. He wanted to get into the game, and so he came here, and then he quite famously immediately went south, and he had a good relationship with the small courthouses and of the South, where he had to try voting rights cases and school desegregation cases, and he developed a method of investigating those cases that was quite strong and quite good. And when the Kennedys came to town, they looked at his files and looked at him and said, "Why don't you stay, even though you're a Republican?"
All right, so taking your dad out of it, right, and the familial tugs of loyalty and all of
Filial
that,
loyalty.
filial loyalty, take all that aside.
Yes.
There's there's an argument that the Eisenhower administration doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves on civil rights stuff, and that the Kennedy administration gets way too much credit for civil rights, when in fact he kind of backburnered it when it was politically expedient in ways that you would have expected LBJ to do that kind of thing, and instead LBJ obviously leaned into it. Do you think that's fair? Do you think
Well, so Evan Thomas, the Washington writer, wrote a book about the Eisenhower administration's civil rights record, which is not bad and was much better than the vast majority of the Democratic parties.
Right.
And Dad's role in re-energizing the Civil Rights Division in those last years, and Judge Tyler's, is an evidence of the Eisenhower administration's energy that they were trying to bring to those cases. And in all kinds of ways, the Eisenhower administration appointed much better judges than the Kennedy administration. In fact, great heroic judges, Judge Tuttle, Judge Wisdom, Judge Brown, Judge Johnson. These are great heroes of the civil rights movement, all appointed by President Eisenhower. So there's a good argument for Eisenhower being stronger than he gets credit for. Absolutely. I think my father would say, and I know you want me to take him out of it, but he was there.
Yeah, well, that's why I asked. He's kind of like Zelig. He's in, yeah.
Well, over at the White House, things might have been backburnering on civil rights, and they were a little sort of, what's this all about? In the Civil Rights Division and under Robert Kennedy, there was a real upsurge in energy. And the Kennedys appointed Burke Marshall, who was a really outstanding lawyer, Yale Law School, Yale undergraduate, brilliant legal strategist, and Dad, and they kept Dad. And then they really were quite good in energizing the Justice Department's efforts in civil rights. Sometimes, in quiet courthouses all across the South, but where it wasn't in the newspapers. And but that was a invigoration of energy. And getting the FBI to work a little harder on civil rights cases was also important. And then, but the story of the Kennedy administration is that they took over at the White House. They took a little time, but by the time of Ole Miss, when James Meredith went into the University of Mississippi, and Dad was there for that, they got better. And President Kennedy gave really one of the great civil rights speeches of all time about the moral cause for treating people fairly before the law, and that was before he was assassinated. So I think. It'd
be impressive if it was after he was assassinated.
Yeah, well, I know, but the point is he was still president. And,
yeah.
And so, I think it was a hard challenge getting our country to face up to its problems with a caste system, and a hard challenge to get it to face up to, what was wrong, not only in the South, but across the country with regard to the treatment of blacks in the United States. And it's quite remarkable that from 1958 or whatever, the late 50s through to 1970, with some violence, but not a lot of violence, or not really backbreaking violence, we did make significant positive changes for our country. And the sad part about the Democratic Party now and some of its rhetoric is that they understate those achievements, which happened Republicans and Democrats, whites and blacks together, Congress, the White House, the media. There are a lot of people that played positive roles in changing our country when it comes to treating African Americans properly with regard to voting, especially, and other things as well. And so I think the game of who was better and who did this is a little tired. But Dad, let me be clear about this: John Doar in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department was quite good in all three administrations: Eisenhower Administration, Kennedy Administration, and the Johnson Administration.
No, so I totally agree with you about the rhetoric about that comes out of a lot of Democrats these days, because first of all, just on the facts, the Georgia law is not Jim Crow 2.0,
Exactly.
right? But second of all, when you say that there's been no progress, or when you say fairly minor changes to voting procedures are Jim Crow 2.0, what you're actually doing is minimizing Jim Crow 1.0, right?
Yeah.
And you're minimizing the work that people did. And it's kind of also just a fundamental slander of the American people, because America is wildly less racist than it was 50 years ago. And weirdly, conservatives don't want to admit that, and liberals don't want to admit that. And it's just very strange to me. Like, racial progress is a good thing, and it's like the left doesn't want to lose the issue, and the right doesn't know how to talk about this stuff, and it's just very strange to me.
I'm surprised you say conservatives don't want to admit that, because I think that we do. I mean, I do all the time, and I'm this is one where I don't see an equally bad behavior on the right compared to.
I don't think it's equally bad. I just think they don't know how to talk about it well. I mean, I'm not talking about you or Jason Riley or a handful of other people.
Right. There is all kinds of, there is. But that's one thing that, given Dad's experience and my experience growing up and living in New York and working on any poverty programs, that, that's one thing I can do. I mean, I'm trying to run AEI, but talking about race and poverty, which are sensitive issues for a lot of people, but is something that I have done for a very long time in very charged atmospheres, and watched my dad do in very charged atmospheres. And my general approach is, don't be afraid to talk about it, and to state the facts, and don't be defensive or scared, or we've silenced ourselves in this political correctness language and I think that's too bad, and I don't give into it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my point about conservatives not speaking, or Republicans not being able to speak about it much, is I think they don't want to be seen as praising what is perceived as Democratic accomplishments 50 years ago, right? I mean, because the Democrats want to take all the credit for the civil rights stuff, and so they think, well, why are we going to compliment them? That's our party's issue.
Do that. I mean, they should.
I agree they shouldn't do it, but I think that happens.
We all know, everybody in our world, Jonah, knows that when the Civil Rights Act passed, and the Voting Rights Act passed, a greater majority of Republicans voted for it than Democrats. Right. And that the real Jim Crow party of the country was the Democratic Party for 100 years, and the Republicans' record on civil rights was really quite outstanding, and is quite outstanding over the long history. And we just got to. That's a good terrain to fight on, because we're right.
So my strategy going into this was just simply to figure out what issues I knew you got excited about, and that was where we talk about. So kind of watch this for a segue. So we've talked about civil rights and your dad's role in it, and all that. Part of my biggest problem with the Jim Crow 2.0 stuff, or one of my biggest problems, is we talk about it as if Jim Crow was primarily about voting, when in fact the voting part of Jim Crow, which was bad, right? The voter suppression stuff was bad. But the reason why the voter suppression stuff was necessary was to prevent Black people from voting away the worst things about Jim Crow, which was the segregation, the economic immiseration. If you go back and you look in when those Jim Crow laws start, it was not to keep Black people from voting. It was to keep Black workers from being able to find jobs, right? It was because all of a sudden you had labor markets with ex-slaves, and that meant that all of a sudden economic interests had to pay competitive prices. And the Jim Crow laws were, in many respects, I mean, they were heinous, oppression in moral terms, but a lot of the economic reasons for it was it's a kind of crony capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's all true, but I do think the history is that the strategy was that the way to go at it in the way that would lead to the best outcomes over the long period would be through voting. That was the key to get things started. Dr. King thought that, and so did the Kennedy Justice Department. And,
I agree with that. My only point is that the reason why they put in Jim Crow in the beginning, was to protect basically a feudal system or try to recreate a feudal system.
Yeah,
I totally agree with you about the way to get rid of it is just allow democracy to start healing things, right? Yeah. And but that gets me to my point about poor people, right? So you came up in many ways in egghead circles as a I'll be unfair about it, as one of those squishy do-gooder anti-poverty people.
No, that's not true. That's not true. That's completely wrong. I was a hardcore welfare reformer. I was the conservative, make people go to work, not receive benefits, member of the Pataki administration and the Bloomberg administration. So I never really was identified with the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party. I was always more of kind of a Clinton Gingrich welfare reformer placed in the Pataki administration. Even in the Pataki administration, I was the strongest on work requirements, anti-fraud protections, very strong child support enforcement efforts to make absent parents who weren't supporting their children support their children. So I wouldn't say that's fair. When I came to AEI,
I did say I was going to do it unfairly.
I would say one more thing about that. It's an interesting little fact. I was at an event I used to go to every year at the Heritage Foundation that was sort of conservative approaches to helping low-income Americans, and I would speak at and participate in. And I was there at the end of the Bloomberg administration, representing myself and the Bloomberg administration, when people from AEI found me and said, "Hey, why don't you come to AEI when this ends?" But no, I'm pretty in the world of I'm not viewed as, I'm a nice guy. People like me. I get along with people, but I'm pretty strong on the great benefits of strong work requirements and safety net programs in a way that a lot of Republicans are not. So I get to the right of them, including the new right, who tend to be a little, in my view, a little pro benefits and transfer payments, where I'm about employment and self-reliance. And so no, I never was a squishy do-gooder Republican.
Fair enough. So
take that, damn it.
So, my first stint at AEI was in the 1990s, and I did enormous amount of stuff about welfare reform, and welfare reform was basically, as you recall, sort of the defining domestic policy issue of the 1990s in some ways. And it feels like it's essentially vanished as a major political issue of any kind. It's still a major public policy issue, but it's now one of those public policy issues like agriculture subsidies, that you can kind of talk about freely, because it's kind of been drained of a lot of its culture war aspects.
A little bit. I will say, I think you're right to the extent that over time, the program that Clinton and Gingrich changed, the AFDC TANF program, has remained as it was changed. I fought every effort to turn it back, and we've kept it exactly where it was created because it works to get people into employment. But it's become quite small, and all these other programs that somehow are been able, Medicaid, food stamps, housing assistance, childcare, refundable tax credits, which the Democrats can blur and sort of not make it sound like they're elements of what I would consider to be the welfare system, have been able to grow up and be supported, and so no one talks about them. But every time there's ever an effort to give people cash, either through tax refunds or just direct payments without any requirement for work, and I and others at AEI and other places say, hey, wait a minute, that's you're going back. It turns out to be extremely popular politically. That is one issue where the rhetoric of work over welfare and expectations for people seeking assistance, when you get it discussed, when it gets past the wonky talk and into actually radio and television and conversations and political dynamics, Republicans rally to it because they realize it's very, very powerful. The American people, in their common sense, don't like it that hardworking Americans who are really struggling go to the grocery store and scrimp and save to afford what they can to take home to their families. And they look across the aisle and there's someone who's not working, but is using a government benefit card to acquire products that are more expensive than they can afford. They don't like that. And when you tell them that there's going to be more of that, if you allow these cash benefits or refundable tax credits to flow again, it turns out it's very popular politically, and you can defeat efforts to increase those things, even against the, as you like to call them, the commanding heights of American media and politics, which is saying, oh no, they're just child tax credits. They're just tax refunds. They're tax cuts.
Right.
They just happen to be cash payments to people that don't work and don't make any effort to address their underlying circumstances. When you get that discussed in that way, it's very strong politically.
But we should clarify. I mean, I'm sure you don't disagree with this. The reason to be opposed to that stuff is not because it's a good political issue. The reason to be opposed to that stuff is it's a bad public policy.
Yes, I agree with it. But you started out by saying the politics issue has gone away or is dead. And so I wanted to bring that up. Absolutely. That's the reason why we should be opposed to it. And I make those arguments most of the time. But I'm a little surprised sometimes because I had worried that maybe that issue has disappeared from the political consciousness. And then whenever we get into the debate and the discussion, it turns out, well, actually, no. Like, for instance, when they did a referendum in Wisconsin on cash benefits, and it was during a time when the Democratic turnout because of a Supreme Court thing was high, and it was overwhelmingly rejected. The idea that we should give cash benefits to people who don't make any effort to work from the government. People don't believe in that, and they shouldn't. It's very bad public policy.
Right. So the reason I was offering that clarification was because I want to ask you, can you just make the case to the persuadable person who says, what's wrong with giving a little cash to poor people? Right? I mean, like universal basic income is very popular in weird corners on the left and the right. What is your case for requiring work when it comes to welfare?
Because the practice of participating in the labor market, of getting up and having a structure and a discipline to your life that's organized around earning a wage is enormously good for you as a human being. You're setting an example for your children. You're setting an example for your spouse or your friends. You're participating in the community. You're engaging with other people in a human way. And that's just, there's a lot of evidence that work is good for your health. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your ability to be a better parent, both emotionally and also financially. So that's the answer, is that it brings a sort of structure to your life and an involvement of your life in the human experience that and it is truly staying at home, receiving cash. I would say when these issues would come up, and this included families with children in them, if you're receiving a check from Washington or an electronic payment to a debit card, it's so much easier to stay inside and draw the shades. And no one knows what's going on. I think it contributes to excessive drug use and substance abuse issues. So I think there's just a lot of evidence, and I marshal it every time, on the benefits of work for people and communities and families that override this idea that what's the problem, send people a little cash.
Yeah. So,
And just one more thing, John, just so we're clear, I am a big supporter of sending people a little cash if they work.
right.
So I'm a big supporter of subsidies and child care assistance and public health insurance. That sometimes makes my conservative friends mad. But if people are working, I want to support them. But we need to organize our society around the expectation that able-bodied adults have to make some effort to earn their own success.
So one of the things that's eclipsed poverty issues in the cable news shout show universe for the last 10 years is at least is inequality, right? And this always frustrates me greatly because if you pay really close attention, like 70% of the people who are talking about inequality don't even really mean fighting poverty. What they mean is grabbing bigger chunks out of rich people,
Yeah,
and some sort of conception of an aesthetic notion about the income distribution in the country. And it reminds me, when I was listening to you talk, there's this woman, Lita Cosmides, who's one of the founders of evolutionary psychology, and she makes the point that evolutionary psychology enters these kinds of debates in two ways. One that's helpful to the liberal point of view, and one that's helpful to the conservative point of view. For the progressive point of view, human beings in a natural environment, in a tribal environment, they don't like it when some hunter takes a bigger share, a bigger portion than is fair from the communal wildebeest or whatever it is. Equally, for the conservative point of view, our brains find it even more offensive when somebody takes any share at all without contributing to the hunt in any way, right? And it's our natural taste buds for a sense of sort of social justice ping on sort of both sides of this. And my problem is, and I get that. My problem is that at least caring about poor people is the route to helping poor people. Caring about absconding with the of tearing down rich people for its own sake is not actually, in matters of public policy, a great way to sort of improve the plight of poor people.
completely agree. Absolutely true, and actually harmful. I mean, the growth that comes from a free market economy that allows people to reap the benefits of their success creates an enormous amount of opportunity and upward mobility opportunity and income for low-income Americans. And in New York City, when I ran the programs there, we served millions of people that were struggling. They were focused on them moving up, not bringing down, Mike Bloomberg. That wasn't really
Right.
their concern. And we've made a lot of progress in bringing people above a minimum standard of living. And we've got to do a little better, I think, at helping people move from there safely in the middle class, so they don't need variety of subsidies that supplement their work, that they have the skills and education and qualities that allow them to earn an income that allows them to not receive any government subsidy. But that's the next challenge. But the answer to that is also not reducing inequality. That's a distraction from the real task.
All right. So I'm just brilliantly managing my segues here. You
Yes.
brought up your work in New York. We both care a lot about New York, even though you're from this place. I think it's pronounced
Yeah, it's really
Brooklyn.
appalling, John. This is one aspect about you that you are such a Manhattan person, an Upper West Side.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
know what you are, Jonah, but you're not really a New Yorker because you don't know Brooklyn. And
Um,
and so so I'm kidding you, but the thing is that yes, I am. I grew up. Yes, I love New York, and New York. And it's a sad story because we made a lot of progress in the '90s under Giuliani and Bloomberg and Pataki, and I think it's gone backwards a little bit. It's not anywhere near what it was when you and I were growing up, in my opinion. It's much stronger because the city is just so much more vibrant, and largely due to the success of Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island. But the city is a little bit little bit weaker than it was, and we've got to think about ways to get it back to where it was.
Yeah. So I guess I was going to ask how you think New York's doing. Um, and just one of the other points. Not only is a free market economy good for poor people and all that kind of stuff, having really rich taxpayers helps pay for a lot of the programs that people think need to be there, and you can get to a point where you chase away your tax base.
And there's some of that going on. I think New York has had a flight of that because of higher taxes and a quality of life issue with regard to the homeless. They're not. I have done a lot of reporting on this, and something I'm trying to write. And the apparatus of the social services system, when it has to do with homeless outreach, for instance, that helps people get off the streets and into a food pantry or soup kitchen or a temporary housing shelter, that's fallen apart in the city under the two administrations. Not as strong as it was under Bloomberg. They've changed the rules with regard to and the message that's being sent by the welfare system, from one of calling their offices job centers. Our job is to help get you a job, to now benefit maximization centers, which is how do we get you as much government benefit as possible. That sends a different message. They're not as supportive of charter schools. I spent a day in one of Eva Moskowitz's school, Success Academy in New York City last month. Remarkable. 20,000 students are in her programs now. They're the highest performing school district in the state versus any school district, not just school districts serving the poor, not just school districts serving New York City kids, any school district. And they do it because they apply a rigor and an attention to detail and a discipline that kids need. And yet the mayor's office, better under Adams than de Blasio, is not really enthusiastic about this enormous achievement for New York City's most poor families. And that to me is just shocking. Mayor Bloomberg was always very supportive of those efforts. And so there are a variety of ways in which the city has gone backwards. Crime is another, probably the most glaring, where the emphasis put on reducing crime and ensuring that people who have committed a crime are incarcerated in some way appropriately, has been lost. And as a result, there are more people in the city who are dangerous. And that's just very, very damaging to the health and quality of the city.
So I hate saying this because it conflicts with some of my other commitments. But on a cultural level, I have to say that one of the things I think, and I'm going to try and taunt you on this, but one of the things I think that makes New York less charming, I agree with all the stuff that you laid out. Than it used to be, is the problem with is capitalism itself. Insofar as when we were growing up in New York, there were a lot of unique forms of commerce you could find no place else. Mom and pop places, family businesses, even manufacturing things, right? And all that kind of stuff. Growing up in Manhattan, there was like one McDonald's on 72nd Street, and there's like a Blimpies on 86th Street. And other than that, the sort of fast food chains really did not have a large presence in New York. And one of the
stop here.
I'm sorry,
listeners. This is a product of what I said about Jonah. He is a Manhattan person.
Yeah. So
what he's describing has left New York, has left Manhattan. That's true.
Yeah.
Manhattan has become a movie set. I mean, Little Italy doesn't exist anymore. Even the Upper West Side, it's not the old New York.
I agree.
But if you want that, there's plenty of it in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, and Staten Island. And that's much more than half the city. So I'm sorry that Manhattan has been taken over by, affluent people in chain stores, and that's true. But there's a bigger city than Manhattan.
I hear rumors to this effect, but I mean, like, how is one supposed to even find this out? I mean,
you take the subway, you take the 2 or the 3 to Borough Hall, or you take the Staten Island Ferry, or you go uptown to the Yankee game. I mean, Jonah, have you ever been out of Manhattan?
I have been out of Manhattan. My dad grew up on Gun Hill Road in the Bronx,
Okay.
and and I like the Arthur Avenue, Little Italy, quite a
Yeah,
bit.
there you go. There you go. Now you're talking.
Although I will say, I am not an advocate of violence in any way. But when I see people going past 100-year-old Italian sub shop to go into the Subway sandwich shop next to it on Arthur Avenue, it makes me want to take out a baseball bat. But part of
Boy, you
capitalism is
really
letting
are a
people make.
cultural snob. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, there's that. I'm not disputing that.
Well, that may be a function of price, Jonah.
I agree.
And I think you're a little harsh on Blimpie. I had a Blimpie on in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and that was a ritual after late basketball practices to go to the Blimpie and watch them put the sandwich together.
Blimpie's much better than a Subway. I'll just say that. But
yes.
But no, it's the broader point I was sort of getting at is it's not just capitalism. It was also the success of the Giuliani administration, in particular, in fighting crime.
Yes.
And national chains did not want to go into a place where the crime was going so high. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing that in reverse in places like San Francisco and even New York, with like CVS's and Walgreens and those kinds of things pulling out of neighborhoods because of the crime issue. And, you know, it's fun. When I was growing up, I never understood how the bad neighborhoods in places like Paris or London were the suburbs, and the safe and most expensive places were the quote unquote inner city. And you're right. Manhattan is sort of like the Parisification of New York, in that the center of the city is for rich people, and it kind of been denuded of cultural distinctiveness. And both the good and bad stuff about real city living has been pushed out in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there's some truth to that. Although I was with some people who were saying that, and we happened to be on the train going to New York. We got off the train. We came up in the old Madison Square Gardens part of Penn Station, and you walk through that tunnel past New Jersey Transit and Long Island Railroad, and you come up onto 7th Avenue. And I looked at them and I said, I'm looking around here. I'm not seeing a lot of rich people.
No, that's true.
I mean, it looks to me like far more diverse and in both economics and race and ethnicity than certainly Washington, D.C. or San Francisco.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was teasing you about Manhattan. Manhattan has lost a lot of what you described, but it's still amazing.
Yeah, there are pockets of real charm still. I was down in the West Village for dinner a couple months ago, and I hadn't walked around that neighborhood much for a while, and it's fantastic.
Yeah. Let's talk about the American Enterprise Institute.
Okay. How's it going?
I think very well. I really love it. I love this place that you built, Jonah, and I want to tell you that. And no, but you did. You and a lot of other people have contributed to making a really great institution, and I'm just trying to keep it true to its principles and allow our scholars and our participants in the public debate to bring their wisdom to the discussion in the most effective and impactful way possible. And I think we're doing it. And I also think we brought some people here, Adam White, Matt Continetti, Yuval Levin, a whole host of others that have made us just really strong. And we've also, we don't owe, allegiance. We don't bend the knee or kiss the ring to any party or any politician. And that makes us credible. And that makes us trustworthy and makes us stronger. And so I'm very happy with how things are going. And the country's got some problems, but we're in a better position to help solve them than we would be if we had chosen a different course.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question about, this is just for my edification's sake, to illuminate your thinking about it. I can't remember the guy's name, it's Niskanen, for that Cato guy. He wrote this book about how the way to move public policy is all basically like a B2B model. It's elites talking to elites. Trying to do it through elections in mass media is kind of crazy. That's one model where you get the smartest people from the right positions and the right responsibilities in a room, and you sort of constitutional convention behind closed doors, let's hammer this thing out kind of model. And then the other model is sort of a mass market model where you try to move voters and move the public debate rather than the sort of expert debate to your position. And I would say historically that has always been, among think tanks, that's always been more of a heritage model than the way AI does it. And I would say in recent years, it is explicitly and almost exclusively the heritage model insofar as trying to win arguments over cable news and Steve Bannon's TV show or podcast or whatever. We don't do a lot of that. I mean, we got a lot of pundits who do a lot of TV. I do a lot of TV. Mark Thiessen does a lot of TV. Cottonetti does. I mean, you can go down a long list. But because we don't have a one voice policy, we aren't necessarily pushing the AEI line in every TV hit or anything like that.
Well, so there isn't an AEI line, but
Right.
but I will say I do think that I'm kind of an in between person, or both of those. I'm very for communicating with our principal audience, which are policymakers. But I definitely think that principal audience is broader and bigger than we would think if we only focused on federal members of Congress and the people around the White House. I think the governor's offices are very important players. I think the state legislators are, and I also think the people in Washington that are in the federal policymaking world, they listen to their community too. And so you can't just communicate with them behind closed doors. You have to be in the battle. You have to be taking your argument to the media in a broader way than just, research papers produced for an audience of 7. And so I really have pushed hard to make our distribution of our work much broader and to be read by as many people as possible, because that does help with your efforts to impact the elites. And so, I pay attention to how many people get AEI this week and AEI today, and I pay attention to our scholars whose readerships are particularly high because they publish in things like the Dispatch or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. And I want our scholars to make appearances on television because that is where some people get their information. And so I think you got to play in that world if you want to have impact on elites. And I think we're doing that pretty well. We got to keep at it.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, there has always been that kind of portfolio management at AEI. My first job at AEI was working for Ben Wattenberg, who was a syndicated columnist and
right.
TV show host.
Saying I'm not new to that, but I do think you got to play in both worlds.
Yeah. So AEI, often gets called neoconservative, sometimes accurately, depending on who's saying it, and sometimes as a pejorative. I kind of think the term has lost all utility for normal political positioning and framing of things. You are not a perfidious Hebrew in the employ of the IDF who's manipulating America for the benefit of Israel, which is the way a lot of people mean neocon.
I mean, so this is where you and I are different in that our backgrounds are different and our education is different. But I was first attracted to the conservative world through the neoconservatives. Norman Podhoretz gave a speech at my high school, and Irving Kristol, and that sort of I was a liberal mugged by reality, and now I'm a conservative. Had a reaction to the sort of my silly thinking of the worst excesses of the Great Society liberals. And so there was that. And then also, I think it was the Committee for the Present Danger and the recognition that, Scoop Jackson and John F. Kennedy were right, as Ronald Reagan was, that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. I was very attracted to that. And those two things are what I think of as neoconservative. And that's where I come in. I have to sort of join in that world. Is that wrong? I don't think that's wrong. I think I will say, however, the post 9/11 wars perception of the neoconservatives is not what I just described, and but was AEI and could be characterized as as the aspect of the AEI foreign and defense team. And I think over the last 5 or 6 years or 7 years, we've become broader than that and focused on China much stronger, focused on the defense budget much stronger, and are not entirely identified with the sort of the management of the 9/11 wars. And
I mean,
how does that sound to you? Is there some truth to what I just said?
Yeah. I think so. I think your first. So this is a minor obsession of mine, right? So,
Okay.
Your first point about the mug by reality thing is, in my opinion, the real essence of the story of what neoconservatism was. And I would argue, and have argued recently on here, that actually the first quote unquote neoconservatives were actually most of the guys around National Review, who predated Irving, right? Because these were all former communists who moved right. James Burnham, Whittaker Chambers, Max Eastman. You can go down a long list. But we didn't need to call them neoconservatives back then because they were just like the first conservatives post-war, and so they just got called the conservatives.
Yeah.
And then but it's that disillusionment, Great Society, liberalism, where I kind of push back on your narrative, which I don't think is wrong. It was just alluding to why I think there's a problem with this, is that the first neoconservatives were not about foreign policy at all, right? It's like the Irvings and the James Q. Wilsons, and you can go down a long list, and you just basically go down the old seating chart of AEI from the 1960s, and it's those guys who saw that the unintended consequences of the Great Society were
well,
kind
that's
of thought,
fair,
right?
Yeah, and I should say that this is a small little chapter in this that going back to my dad left the Johnson administration to join something that was a reaction to the overreach of the Great Society on poverty policy and the management of those efforts through the federal government as opposed through local governments and local businesses and business people. And that's a very small little sub footnote of my father's career, but I grew up in an environment that was joined in that group of people that were uncomfortable with the excesses of Sarge Shriver and the Johnson administration.
And so my only point about bringing up the neocon thing is that I think people, particularly post 9/11, I think you're right, is that it lost all of the historical context and just became coded warmonger, right? Or hawk. And the truth is, there have always been foreign policy hawks who were more hawkish, who weren't neocons.
Yeah.
Right. If National Review is not neocon, or Barry Goldwater is not a neocon, Barry Goldwater was for rollback, not containment. Right. And so, which is more hawkish than containment. And but anyway, I'm just sort of wondering. We've talked about this offline. You gave your State of the Institute address not too long ago. I thought the sacrifice of the 50 ox to Baal was really well done, but I'm not
even sure what that means.
Don't pull the string. Just let it go by. People blame it all on me.
Okay. That's sort of like Trump saying about Biden. I'm not sure he knows what he's talking about.
Well, we beat Medicare, man.
Yeah.
Does it feel to you like there is a coherent conservative movement anymore? Is like when you talk about conservatives, can you speak confidently about a group anymore?
Because there isn't a leader. There isn't a leader that pulls it all together in a positive way that unites us and brings us forward. President Trump is a leader, but he's not really a conservative. Of course, there's another New Yorker. I've watched him all my life, be very friendly with lots of big spending Democrats. He reminds me of a Rockefeller Republican. He's not really a conservative. And to me, the world on the right is united only in its passion of anger at the excesses of the left. And that brings us all together. And, when President Biden has a performance like he did the other night on the debate stage, that just makes us all not want to be that and not want to be part of that. And that sort of misleading of America by pretending something isn't true that is clearly true. So, but on ideology and on specific issues, we're all over the map, and no one knows what conservative means anymore because people equate it with the far right. Well, what's the far right? So we're a little bit discombobulated on the right, and I'm hoping you and others and Yuval will sort of try to bring it all back together, Matt Continetti, and along with some significant new emerging political leader, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, let's make Yuval and Continetti do it.
Yeah.
But that sort of gets to my point about the inside playing versus the outside playing, right? The intra elite persuasion stuff versus public stuff. Right now, it is very difficult to argue that public policy matters very much in electoral politics, right? I mean, yeah, sure, immigration, fine, and a handful of other hot button issues. But you watch those Republican primary debates, and with the exception of Vivek Ramaswamy, they were all arguing back as if we still lived in the Reagan era of GOP, where they're all arguing about public policy and your tax cut won't do this and your, whatever won't do that. And none of it mattered. None of it moved anybody. And because the 800-pound gorilla was Donald Trump, and Donald Trump reverses himself on public policy constantly, and abortion is just the latest example. So you say it's important to have a public-facing role, and look, I'm not trying to argue against interest here in terms of original, deep, mathematical-driven scholarship. I am not a heavy hitter at AEI. A lot of my contribution is the public-facing stuff. But
you're a very heavy hitter at AEI.
Whatever.
Go ahead.
But what is the actual benefit of trying to talk to the public when the public doesn't care?
You spend a lot of time sort of above listening to the noise and discussion in the sort of chattering classes, and I get that, and I do too. But you're wrong that some of this doesn't end up in public policy. It does all the time. Things happen outside of the realm of the coverage that affects American lives. Tax policy changes, welfare policy does or does not change. The president does something, and the Congress does something crazy, like the big Build Back Better legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, that just really did damage to our fiscal strength. So those things do matter in public policy. And I should just point out to you that the Supreme Court, while everybody's been, calling about how nothing happens and we're stalemated and we have no leaders, and the Supreme Court in this term and in previous terms has done really dramatic things, I think mostly for the better, that are going to benefit America. And that happened. So I don't think that we're all sort of removed from policy. Policy happens every day in some places, in the governors, in state legislatures, and here in Washington. And to think that nothing happens, nothing changes, it's all the same, all we're doing is arguing, and no results ever happen, I think is inaccurate.
All right, so I get what you're saying, and it's a perfectly fine correction, but let me sort of push back a little bit on it. I agree with you that policy happens every day, but let's take, Build Back Better or the American Rescue Plan or any of that kind of stuff. I think there were some defensible things in some of those places somewhere, kind of thing, but for the most part, I think that was basically Biden and Democrats generally rewarding stakeholders in their coalition with goodies. And to the extent there was a conversation about the contents of that legislation, it was basically made amongst various sort of corporatist stakeholders on the left, the unions, the environmental groups, and all that kind of stuff. I don't think the content of that legislation was particularly shaped by the public debate, is sort of my point, right?
Yeah, and I think that in that case it's true because they did that in a purely partisan way. And that's where Yuval's book comes in.
Mhm.
Really good, solid, lasting public policy happens when we engage with the other side and work it out and create something that gets bipartisan support and cross, and that didn't happen there. And that's why I think it's been so unsuccessful. It's funny, you merge two things. I think the American Rescue Plan, I think, was a Trump sort of COVID response, which was bipartisan.
Yeah.
And an argument can be made that given what happened in COVID, where we shut down the economy, we had to do something big to protect people's livelihood and well-being. And we did it. And it's kind of remarkable, the extent to which, people were kept whole during a very, very strange and difficult time when public health experts were pushing really dramatic upset to our economy. But what happened was that Biden got elected and he won the Congress, and then he pushed through, I'm going to do another one when it wasn't needed.
Right.
And that was, that's, I think, could be one of the reasons why he's so unpopular right now.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I appreciate the correction because that's a good point. I would say, part of my answer to that would be what Yuval has argued before, which is our government is actually pretty good at responding to crises. It's responding to like the normal responsibilities of the job that they suck at, right?
Yeah,
and from the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, all that kind of stuff, and we beat Medicare. No, sorry. I'm just going to say that whenever I can't remember anything from now on.
I know.
So I'm not sure when this is going to air. This may air next, or it may air next week. We haven't quite figured that part out yet. So I don't want to get too tied down to current events, lest they seem outdated. But I am just kind of curious, where, do you think Biden should step down? Do you think Biden shouldn't run again?
Yeah, absolutely. We had we had a gathering at AEI and for the watching of the debate, and I in my normal sort of optimist, things aren't quite as bad as we say they are. Some people say they are. Said to a bunch of young people, well, how fast into this debate do you think one or the other of them will say something that'll really be very cringeworthy and a real problem, embarrassing? And they all said, it'll happen within the first 5 minutes. And I said, no, they can get through the first 5 or 10 minutes. I bet it'll be okay. And then something will happen later. So they said, okay, let's bet. And of course, in the first 30 seconds, I had to pull out $20 and slap it down on the table because I lost the bet. And that was President Biden. So, I think he's, it's 70%, 75% of the American people are unhappy with both choices. One or the other makes a change, then it would improve the quality of the candidates. I would think there's a chance of. So, on the other hand, there's two sides to this. I mean, and this is what's coming out from the Trump supporters, who I observe closely and are friends of mine, is that if he doesn't drop out, there's a chance of a pretty big victory for President Trump and his side, and the Republicans could sweep the Senate and the House, and that does free up a president to do things. But those things could be very positive for the country. So I just would rather the American people had better choices in this, and just an opportunity to evaluate two candidates where they're just of higher quality. And so if President Biden stepped down and the Democrats pick somebody else, maybe there's a chance for that.
What I'm kind of looking forward to, because I think you're right. I think it is inevitable. It's just the sequencing is still in flux, right? Because I think he could brazen it out and refuse to budge or go, and then have another one of these moments, and then it's just completely untenable. And everything we know about people at his age and his state is that additional moments like that are coming, right? And so it's a timing question. But I am looking forward to watching the people on the right, sort of the sort of CPAC kind of world, who have been insisting that Biden's unfit, he's got dementia, he's catatonic, he cannot be president of the United States, all of a sudden saying, well, it's really not that bad. He can ride it out for another 6 months. We can't get rid of him quite yet. And so it's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, if you again, I know you're timing this, but this is right in the sort of fairly early part of the come apart of the Democratic, support for Biden, and the Times is the most amazing. I mean, they were the Journal did reporting on President Biden's issues, and they were very condescending toward it, and of course the Democratic establishment was, and now they're doing the same reporting all over. I mean, see that the thing that I think the Democrats don't understand is that it's sort of sad about President Biden. It is sad about President Biden. No one likes to see someone struggle with the challenges of aging, and he's been in public life for a long time, and he's our president. So I want to be clear about that. But when you go out and talk to the American people and you say something that appears to them to be true is not true, you really undermine your credibility on every other issue, and you make people really angry at leaders for not being straight with the American people. And I think that the Democrats don't understand how upset the American people are at the leads in Washington not telling them the truth. And this is an example of not telling them the truth, in my opinion.
No, I agree with that entirely. I'm having crazy deja vu because, a lot of the people in the mainstream media who went crazy, the whole democracy dies in darkness thing and all that kind of stuff, who went crazy about Trump's quote unquote gaslighting, have been gaslighting us about Joe Biden. And, and also a lot of the arguments about how back in the day, well, it was when Trump would do something crazy, they'd say, well, it's just an isolated incident. I was like, now when Biden's doing something, it's an isolated incident.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of the same sort of arguments where, and the ones that I really cannot stand and are very Yuval Levin-esque in terms of the responsibilities of people who lead institutions, is the number of people who say, well, he doesn't deserve this, right? And deserves got nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And, if you're, if your star basketball player breaks his leg, you don't say, well, we should still have to start him because, he's put so much time in this season. It's like, no, this is just life. And if you can't do the job as president of the United States anymore, you can't be president of the United States anymore. And it's not, you're right. It's unfair and it's not nice. And that's irrelevant. And that's the thing that just sort of gets lost as we follow all of this as like a form of entertainment. So thank you for being here.
Been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.